let's go to the technical stuff.
Yes.
Let's start with, so we're talking here about dieting and weight loss. If I'm trying to lose weight, should I be counting my calories?
So the first point of confusion, people assume calories in, calories out is the same thing as counting calories. That's like saying the law that in order to save money, you have to earn more than you spend is the same thing as keeping a budget. Keeping a budget can help you save money, but it's not the same thing. So let's break down calories in, calories out. Calories inside, pretty straightforward. It is the food you eat, right? The calories in the food that you eat. Now, I would add one caveat to that, the metabolizable energy. So when we say calories is literally a unit of energy. And so I'll have some people say, well, calories aren't a real thing. You can't look at calories under a microscope. You're right. It refers to the potential energy contained in the chemical bonds of food that through the process of digestion, absorption, and metabolism, that energy is captured in one way or another. So that's the energy into the system. Calories out is more complicated. So that involves a few different energy outputs. The first one being your basal metabolic rate. So your BMR is basically the cost of keeping the lights on. So if you just laid down, didn't move, that's how many calories your body would burn. And that's actually, for most people, the majority of the calories they burn per day. It's around 50 to 70%, depending on how active they are.
And it fluctuates person to person. So as a man with fairly big muscles there, yours will be bigger than mine because
Correct.
You have more going on over there.
Yeah,
so.
you can tie about, at least based on the regressions, you can tie about 90% of the variance in BMR to someone's lean mass.
Okay.
If you look at the studies, it's very tightly correlated with lean mass, right? Because lean tissue is more metabolically active than non-lean tissue. So BMR's one bucket. Then you have what's called the thermic effect of food. So your TEF, our bodies are kind of like, for lack of a poor analogy, but an analogy that works, is cars, like internal combustion engine. You don't just put petrol or gas in your car and all of a sudden it just spontaneously starts up. You gotta start it. The battery puts in energy so you can get energy out of the fuel, right? Your body has to put in energy to extract the energy out of the food that you eat. And so a lot of the confusion, people say, well, calories in, calories out assumes that all calories are equal. It doesn't, because TEF accounts for this. Because, for example, protein has a higher thermic effect of food than carbohydrate or fat. So if you look at...
protein requires more energy to basically process it.
Correct. So if you look at, like say, fats, for example, TEF is about 0 to 3%, meaning if you eat 100 calories from dietary fat, you capture about 97 to 100 calories of it. Carbohydrates, about 5 to 10%. So if you eat 100 calories from carbohydrate, you capture about 90 to 95 calories from it. A lot of that depends on the fiber content. The more fiber, the lower the metabolizable energy. So fiber actually has a higher thermic effect of food as well. Then protein is about 70 to 80%. So if you eat 100 calories from protein, you capture about 70 to 80 calories. So some people out there will say, well, there's negative calories. No, those don't exist. You're always getting more energy out of it than you put in, but some are lower than others, right? And so that TEF is about 5 to 10% of the energy you expend per day. So now we've got BMR, TEF, and then you have your physical activity, which we can further break into two different buckets. The first one is obvious, which is exercise, right? You go to the gym, burn some calories, and that's energy out. The second one is less intuitive. It's called non-exercise activity thermogenesis, NEAT. And that is the small, unconscious movements that you make per day. I'll give you an example. Like what I'm doing, like now it's not subconscious because I'm thinking about it, but fidgeting, when you're talking with your hands, pacing, right? In fact, they've actually shown that people who have a more, they call it obese resistant phenotype, when they eat more, they tend to just become spontaneously more active without realizing it. And so people who are more obese prone, when they eat more food, they tend to not compensate by becoming more spontaneously active.
Oh, interesting.
And people, it's kind of pedantic, but it's important to understand the difference. I'll hear people say, well, I'm gonna take the steps and get my NEAT up. No. You made a decision, that's exercise, okay? The reason being Neat really isn't consciously modifiable, right? And so I'll give you an example, like an extreme example of this. So when I was getting ready for my last bodybuilding show back in 2010, the fatigue that you deal with is unbelievable. It's hard to describe in words. Soul crushing would be a way to describe it. And I had gotten done, I'd trained 2 hours at the gym that day. I'd done an hour of cardio, got home, and I remember I sat down on the couch, and my wife at the time, she had like Real Housewives of whatever county on the TV. I hated those shows. But the remote was about 7 feet away. I watched the entire show. I did not get up and move because I was so fatigued. That's an example of NEAT. And NEAT is very modifiable. So they've shown that even a 10% reduction in body weight can reduce NEAT by up to 400 or 500 calories per day. So a lot of people end up moving less without even realizing it. So here's the rub. So you've got your calories in, you've got your calories out, BMR plus TEF plus NEAT plus exercise. People think of these two things as static. They're not static. And that's what I talk about in the book a lot. We have various adaptations that fight us for weight loss. First of which is on the metabolism side. When you lose body weight, your BMR drops. But part of that is because you're carrying around less weight, right? So if I'm 200 pounds and I drop down to 180 pounds, I just have less mass to carry around, and so your BMR goes down a little bit.
Which again is your base metabolic rate.
Right.
Which is
the cost of keeping the lights on, basically. But there's actually what's called metabolic adaptation, which has shown that with a 10% body weight loss, on average, you can see a reduction beyond what you would expect of 15% for BMR. So let's take an example here, because people will say, well, calorie deficit didn't work for me because I was eating this many calories, I was exercising this much period of time, and I was, like what happened? Well, you thought you were in a calorie deficit. But let's take me, for example. Okay, my BMR, I've had it measured, it's about 2,000 calories, a little bit lower, about 2,000 calories. My total daily energy expenditure is around 3,400 calories per day. So that's all this stuff added up, right? But if I lose 10% of my body weight, for me, 2,700 calories per day is a pretty significant calorie deficit. Mm-hmm. But if I lose 10% of my body weight, if I drop my BMR by 15% of 2,000 calories a day is 300 calories. Drop my NEAT by 400 calories, that's 700 calories. All of a sudden that deficit is no longer a deficit. That's now maintenance, right? Mm-hmm. Now this doesn't happen all at once. This is a progressive thing over time, but there's a reason, like I tell people, I'm like, if it was a calorie deficit, as soon as you, like from the time you did it indefinitely, you would starve to death, right? But all of us, most of us have had the experience of starting a diet, losing some weight, and eventually, even though you're eating the same way, doing the same exercise, it plateaus, right? And then you have to do something else to further establish that deficit. And the other way, so that's on one side where that's kind of working against you to try to bring you back to your original body weight, right? We talk about weight regain. The other side is your hunger hormones go up as you diet, right? So they have shown obese people who lose weight to become normal weight. When you compare them to normal weight people who were never obese with the same similar lean body mass, the formerly obese people have a lower total daily energy expenditure, and they have higher markers of hunger. They have higher appetite. So it's working on both sides of that equation to push you back. So the devil's advocate argument is, well, I ate this amount of calories that should have been a calorie deficit and I didn't lose weight. Or it's all calories are created equal. I'll tell people all calories are created equal, because saying a calorie is not a calorie is like saying second hands on the clock are different. No, they're just a unit of measurement. All sources of calories are not equal. So let's take budgeting, right? I used that earlier. Sports car, okay? So let's say somebody makes $1 million a year, right? If they want to spend let's assume no loans, just for sake of ease. If they want to spend $150,000 on a sports car, but they're still able to pay their mortgage, they can take care of their responsibilities, and they can put money away for retirement, can they buy that sports car? Sure they can, right? And is it a bad investment? I guess you could argue it's a bad investment because they could put the $150,000 in those investments, but maybe that sports car makes them feel good and gives them a little carrot on the end of the stick to, keep working and whatnot. But if I take somebody who makes $200,000 a year, should they buy the $150,000 sports car if it means they can't pay their mortgage, they can't, save for retirement? No, of course not, right? Similar thing with energy, right? So if I'm, somebody who's very active and I burn a lot of calories, is it a big deal if I have a Pop-Tart, say? If I'm still getting enough protein, I'm hitting my target energy, I'm getting enough fiber in and my micronutrients, if that gives me that little carrot on the end of the stick to keep being consistent, not a big deal. But if we're talking about a smaller woman with less lean mass who needs to eat 1,200 calories a day to lose weight, that's not a very good investment, right? It's not a very good use of funds. So what I'll tell people is, people will say, well, how do I know what a deficit is? How do I know how many calories to eat, right?
Because also, just on that point, I heard you talk about food labeling as well and how inaccurate that can
be.
be.
So you can have up to a 20% error in food labeling, right? So some people will use, so what that means is it could say 100 calories, it could be 80, it could be 120. Mm-hmm. Now, I will say if it's coming from a big food company and they have pretty rigorous standards, it's probably not that far off. But they're allowed up to that, right? Because they recognize that some food sources are very heterogeneous. It'd be difficult to get it exactly on. So you'll have some people say, well, see, calorie counting is useless because you can't know exactly how many calories you're taking in. And are you going to get your BMR measured? Are you going to get your NEAT measured? Are you going to get this measured? It can be much more simple than that. Again, financial analogy. I could make the argument that keeping a budget is useless because you never know what inflation is exactly doing. And if you have investments, you can get differential, returns on it. And on the output side, you have unexpected expenses. You have fluctuations in expenses. Your power bill is going to be different from month to month, right? Your car breaks down one month. But if you look at the average over time, you can get a pretty good idea of, on average, what your expenses are like, right? And you can get a pretty good idea over time, unlike entrepreneurs like us, but even like us, you can start to kind of see the trends and get a relatively good idea of what it's going to be. So when it comes to calories in and calories out, yes, tracking exactly can be very, very difficult. But if you are monitoring your body weight and you're being consistent with how you track, you'll know if you're in a calorie deficit. And I think another thing that's crosses people up, this actually showed up on that review of the successful weight loss maintainers. They actually talked about one of the things that was a barrier for them or hard for them was the weight fluctuations. Because if you've ever weighed in every day, have you ever done this where you've weighed every day?
Yeah.
Even first thing in the morning, right?
Up, down.
Bounces all over the place, right? So actually with our coaching and then with our app, we're not just looking at one weight. We encourage people to weigh, as long as it doesn't cause them a lot of stress and anxiety, weigh in daily. And then it's taking the average of those, because day-to-day changes in weight are much more dictated by fluctuations in fluid, but week-to-week and month-to-month averages reflect loss or gain of mass. So, for example, if you're monitoring your body weight, taking averages and looking at that over time, you'll know if you're in a calorie deficit, because on average, you're seeing it go down, right? Now, I wanted to make one more point, which is you don't have to track calories to lose weight. Absolutely not. It's just one methodology, because no matter what you do, you have to have some form of restraint, right? And my friend Peter Attia actually breaks it down nicely into a couple different 3 buckets, right? You can have dietary restraint, which is low carb, plant-based, whole food, whatever it is. You're restricting some sort of food group or type of food, right? Then you have a time restriction. You eat within a certain time frame or a certain window. Then you can have just straight up calorie restriction, where you're tracking and monitoring. What you choose to do, I think a lot in terms of what is best for an individual boils down to their psychology and what feels easy. So this is where a lot of the diet wars start, because somebody will do, say, low carb, right? And they'll get results from that. And they'll say, man, it felt like I wasn't even dieting. And for whatever reason, that clicked with the algorithm in their brain and felt easy. And they got progress from that. But then they assume that everyone else will have the same response. Somebody else does low fat. Somebody else does intermittent fasting, whatever have you. And you have all these stories. Me personally, I'm the kind of person that if I tried to restrict certain foods, I end up getting that binge response, right? But if you tell me I can eat whatever I want, as long as I'm tracking it, I become ridiculously consistent. And I mean, I'm still eating mostly like whole food, minimally processed foods, those sorts of things, because they're better for satiety. But I don't stress out about having some snacks here and there that are, bad.
Consistency.
Because I'm being very consistent, right?
How important is that consistency?
It is the most important thing. So there is actually a meta-analysis. And when I say meta-analysis, think a study of studies, okay? So it's not a new study. It's what they're trying to do in a meta-analysis is they are trying to take studies that are similar and compile them together to see, is there a consensus here? Is there an overall effect here, right? So there was a meta-analysis of where they looked at 14 different popular diets, and these ranged from low carb to high carb, low fat, right? And what they found is on the long term, none of them were better than the others for weight loss. But when they stratified them for adherence, from least adherent to most adherent.
What does that mean?
So people who were consistent, basically. So when they stratified them for, I think, compliance, another way to put it. When they stratified them that way, regardless of diet, a linear effect of adherence on weight loss. So what that tells me is actually the best diet for the individual is the one that can consistently execute. They all function the same way, which is, creating some sort of calorie deficit. Now, some people will say, that's not true. I did a low carb diet and I was eating more food. You probably felt more satiated because you were eating less calorie dense food. You probably were eating a greater quantity in terms of weight of food, but you were eating less calories.